You're welcome back. Still watching Business Incorporated here on Channels Television. Well, the summit is ended. A high point, some of those pronouncements by the United States President, President Biden, about investment and assistance to be given to African continent. But questions have been coming up from that summit, the U.S.-Africa summit, that what really is the interest of the United States in Africa? Well, we have Matt Kindigan now to share a fresh perspective to this. Hi, Matt. Good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for having me on the show today.
Good to have you, Matt. So what can we say is really behind this Biden's administration push to deepen the U.S.-Africa relations?
Yes, well, certainly, in our view, there are several factors that are behind the Biden administration's desire to strengthen relations with Africa. The first is effectively it's looking to try to counter the effects of rising influence of China and especially Russia across Africa over the last couple of years and decades. This has been aggravated by the neglect of U.S.-Africa relations under the previous Trump administration, but this has become particularly concerning since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It was quite well noted in the U.S. that many African countries, including South Africa, declined to side with the U.S. in condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine at the UN earlier this year. So it realizes it has a lot of work to do to try to bring African countries back into its sphere of influence. Secondly, Africa offers huge opportunities for U.S. businesses. It's a very large market, but it's also largely untapped by many many American companies, and they do see it as offering substantial opportunity. And in relation to this, as we are seeing tensions around globalization, rising tensions between the US and China, the US is looking for alternative sources of raw materials, but also alternative markets to China, for example. So certainly there is a significant corporate interest. And thirdly, the US is quite concerned about rising security challenges in parts of Africa, including the Sahel, and it wants to make sure that it is playing as much a role as it can to try to stamp out these security challenges before they become more of a global problem.
Yeah, it's good you mentioned security there, Matt, because a lot of people are wondering how the U.S. is going to deal with the security threat in the Sahel, as you mentioned, given the controversial withdrawal from Afghanistan last year.
Yeah, so certainly the U.S. has had its fingers burnt after withdrawing from the U.S., and it is sort of recalibrating its approach to regions like Afghanistan and also the Sahel. The US is very aware that the Sahel is home to some of the fastest growing and largest and most dangerous sort of terrorist organizations and extremist organizations globally. And it's concerned that the Sahel may become a breeding ground or an incubator for the next global Islamist-inspired terrorist threat, especially those groups that are linked to al-Qaeda. So effectively, the US wants to make sure that its mistakes in Afghanistan are not repeated. And this will likely involve it focusing on dealing with the root causes of the problems rather than reacting to them, and making sure that it has a long-term plan to prevent this from becoming a global problem. And this will take the form of the US government providing financial support as well as technical assistance to some of the most vulnerable countries that are relatively stable at the moment, so including Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, a few others as well, in ensuring that governance standards are upheld, economic growth improves, rule of law is adhered to, democracy, democratic institutions are as strong as they can be as well. And we're also likely to see the US becoming a lot more forthcoming in providing direct and generous assistance to support vulnerable populations, for example, those that are vulnerable to climate change or the effects of conflict, so to prevent more extremist activity from developing. So we certainly would expect the US to take a more multi-pronged, a more direct approach in trying to counter these extremist threats in especially regions like the Sahel.
All right, so we had a lot of pronouncements, especially from President Biden, especially for the one that came from the forum, the investment in billions of dollars and then the assistance. But the impact and the reality of it is actually what catches a lot of people's fancy.
Yes, that's right. So there's a lot can be said about the scale of the investments and the commitments made during the summit, but actually, what will this mean in practice? Overall, our view in the longer term, it's actually a very positive development, and it is a very welcome development that the US is taking engagement and investment and trade with the African continent much more seriously. But in the shorter term, in other words, the next 12 to 18 months, we're likely to see very limited effects. And this is because of what's happening with the global economy. So firstly, the positive effects are actually quite substantial. So in the long term, we're going to see things like several $billion committed towards improving exports from the US, from Africa to the US, so facilitating freer trade, investing in export infrastructure, for example. We also have had very large investments by individual companies. So, for example, Cisco, the big IT tech company, has announced $800 million in investing in cybersecurity in Africa, which is fantastic. And also, the US government has committed to providing $350 million in improving investments into renewable energy, which is also very positive. But the effects on African growth, as I've said, will be relatively limited in the short term. And this is because they will be outweighed by the fact that the US economy is slowing. We are seeing inflation rise to multi-decade highs. Interest rates are also rising very quickly, which is reducing appetite for investment, both in the US, but also by US companies overseas. And as also the US economy slows, we will see weaker demand for African exports, especially raw materials and commodities. So in the short term, we're probably going to see very limited direct effects, but actually over the long term, it is quite a positive development for US Africa trade and exports from
well, talk about long-term expectations there, Matt Kiniga. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks very much.